On November the 17th, 2013, a Tatarstan Airlines Boeing 737 descends towards Kazan, Russia, battling fierce crosswinds. The crew struggles with malfunctioning navigation systems, their instruments silently guiding them 4 kilometers off course. At 1,000 feet, the runway is too high and too far. "Go around," the first officer urges. The captain hesitates, then proceeds with the go-around. Little did they know, this could prove fatal. With the engines at full throttle, the plane starts to angle upward, but the autopilot disconnects without warning. Alarms inside the cockpit start to blare. The pilots wrestle the controls as the nose rises to 25 degrees, their speed dropping fast. The cockpit is visibly shaking as the altimeter starts to spin. Confusion and fear start to mount as the pilots are facing an impossible situation. Can they correct the climb? Or has this routine go-around already sealed their fate? This is the story of Tatarstan Airlines Flight 363. First, let's talk a bit about Tatarstan Airlines. Located 800 kilometers east of Moscow, the Republic of Tatarstan is a culturally rich, autonomous region of Russia, where Christians and Muslims coexist peacefully, and bilingual Russian Tatar street signs reflect its dual heritage. Most residents live in Kazan, a Volga River city famed for its mix of Orthodox and Islamic architecture. From 1993 to 2013, Kazan housed Tatarstan Airlines, Aviakompania Tatarstan in Russia, Tatarstan Havayolari in Tatar, the region's semi-official carrier. The airline operated a mixed fleet of Soviet and Western aircraft, serving destinations across Russia, Europe, Central Asia, and the Middle East. But behind this polished image festered deep-rooted problems: financial instability, corruption, and systemic neglect that would soon cast a shadow over the airline and its homeland. On the evening of November the 17th, 2013, Tatarstan Airlines Flight 363 prepared to depart Moscow's Domodedovo International Airport for a short 75-minute flight to its home base in Kazan. The Boeing 737 carried a light load, with just 44 passengers on board alongside the standard crew of 2 pilots and 4 flight attendants. Among those passengers was Irek Minikanov, son of the President of the Republic of Tatarstan, a fact explicitly known to the cockpit. Commanding the aircraft was 47-year-old Captain Rustem Gabdrakhmanovich Salikov, a former navigator for the airline who had transitioned to piloting and accumulated 2,750 flight hours in his new role. Beside him sat First Officer Viktor Nikiforovich Gutzel, also 47, who brought 2,000 hours of flight experience to the cockpit after previously working as an aircraft mechanic. Flight 363 took off from Moscow at 17:25 local time and climbed to its cruising altitude of 29,000 feet, headed east over the Russian countryside. But there was a problem right out of the gate. The plane's inertial reference system, IRS, which continuously calculates its position using a pair of stabilized gyroscopes, was drifting significantly. In fact, it showed them 4 kilometers to the right of their actual track. Most likely, the pilots had simply entered the plane's starting coordinates into the system incorrectly while they were on the ground, causing all further calculations to become erroneous. As Flight 363 neared Kazan, the air traffic controller informed the pilots of the discrepancy, prompting a lengthy discussion as to what ought to be done about it. Eventually, the crew correctly decided to disengage LNAV mode, in which the autopilot uses the IRS to navigate, and engaged heading select mode in its place, where the pilots direct the autopilot to assume a particular heading using a selector knob. Captain Salikov used the knob to make a 5-degree corrective turn to the right. This was insufficient to return to the proper course. Minutes later, Flight 363 commenced its approach into Kazan. The procedure called for flying east past the airport, executing a 180-degree base turn, and aligning with runway 29 using the Instrument Landing System, ILS, a routine the pilots had practiced repeatedly. However, as they passed the first waypoint, still 4 kilometers left of their intended track, they deliberately turned further left to shortcut the base turn and expedite the landing. The controller immediately noticed the deviation. Mistaking their early maneuver for an attempt to begin the base turn prematurely, he radioed, "Tatarstan 363, early base." First Officer Gutzel, Roger, Tatarstan 363. The controller added, lateral position 6, radial position 9. Captain Salikov bristled at the perceived micromanagement. Sissy pieces of shit. When did they become so f***ing honest? Goodsall stayed silent. At 1918 local time, Salikov initiated the base turn to intercept the localizer, the radio beam marking the runway's centerline. But starting the turn too close to the beam caused them to overshoot it entirely. By the time they leveled out, they were 4 kilometers right of the correct path. Salikov banked left at a steep 40-degree angle to correct, but the overshoot was too severe. Even with the aggressive turn, they lacked the distance needed to intercept the glide slope, the critical descent path to the runway. At 1919, Captain Salikov voiced his skepticism about salvaging the approach. Well, we have neither the landing position anywhere nor anything else. Just 4 miles to go. Now it appears we'll press go around. The Boeing 737's takeoff go-around, toga switch offered a lifeline, automatically initiating a climb by revving engines and pitching up. But Salikov, who had never executed a real go-around in his career, seemed to downplay the maneuver's complexity, treating it as a simple button press. Yet he pressed on, gambling on salvaging the landing, whether due to underestimating their positional error or fearing repercussions for aborting, especially with Tatarstan's president's son on board. The stakes were clear. A go-around would trigger an internal probe, likely blaming him for the botched approach. By 1922, the instruments finally aligned with the localizer, but they were already miles past the glide slope intercept point, the critical juncture to begin descending. Salikov leveled the plane onto runway heading and initiated a 1,200 feet per minute descent, far too shallow to recapture the glide slope. A safe landing was now impossible. Yet at 1,000 feet, Salikov reflexively called out, 1,000 stabilized, no flags. A scripted assurance that everything was normal. But nothing was normal. The approach was wildly unstable, hurtling them toward a point of no return. Seconds later, First Officer Goodsall spotted the runway. I've got it. That's it. Here, the runway is underneath us. Now, we're too high. The precision approach path indicator, 4 lights showing all white, confirmed it. 4 white lights. We're too high, Goodsall explained. Where do you see it? I don't see it. Where is it? Salikov demanded. There's the runway, Goodsall replied, pointing out the window. Realizing a landing was impossible, Salikov instructed, go around. Report go around. We're going around. Position unsuitable for landing. Goodsall relayed the message to the tower controller. Tatarstan 363 going around. Position unsuitable for landing. At that moment, Captain Salikov pressed the toga switches on the throttle levers. The auto throttle shifted into the go-around mode, automatically increasing engine power toward the 83% setting, while the autopilot disconnected with a loud warning. With the extra thrust pitching the 737 steeply upward, the proper procedure required pitching down to maintain a 15-degree climb. However, Salikov appeared uncertain about this adjustment, possibly expecting the autopilot to manage it, despite its disconnection. As the plane began its climb, the pitch angle steadily increased, first to 15 degrees, then 20, while speed initially rose before falling due to excess drag from the steep nose-up attitude. First Officer Goodsall, distracted by an untimely air traffic control message, delayed his monitoring and reconfiguration duties. By the time he retracted the landing gear and input the target go-around altitude of 1,700 feet into the crew alerting system, the aircraft was already climbing past 2,000 feet. Normally, the flight directors would cue a level off at the target altitude, but since the target was lower than their current altitude, that safeguard never activated. After 25 seconds, with the plane pitched 25 degrees nose up and speed dropping below 125 knots, Captain Salikov finally noticed that they had overshot their target and were still climbing rapidly. He immediately made a sharp nose-down input with his control column, abruptly leveling off at about 2,300 feet. However, the sensation that the aircraft was still nose up prompted him to push down again, apparently without checking the attitude indicator, which actually read level. This second input drove the plane to a 20-degree nose-down attitude, triggering a descent rate of 5,000 feet per minute. At that critical juncture, Salikov could have pulled up to level off and safely circle around, but he fell victim to a dangerous spatial illusion. In the absence of external visual references, the human vestibular system struggles to differentiate between gravity and the forces from abrupt maneuvers. When Salikov pushed the nose down, the aircraft's acceleration shifted from just under 1g through 0g into negative g, where occupants feel as if they're being pulled toward the ceiling. Lacking a visible horizon and relying on his physical sensations, he misinterpreted this negative g-force as a steep upward pitch and a backward tumble, leading him to instinctively push the nose down even further, an error that would prove catastrophic for Tatarstan Airlines Flight 363. The massive nose-down input sent the plane into an immediate, near-vertical nosedive, hurtling straight toward the ground at an incredible speed.
What the hell is this?
First Officer Gutzel shouted.
Sink rate.
Blared the ground proximity warning system,
Pull up. Rustic.
calling out his familiar name for the captain.
What the? Where are we going? Bank angle.
Intoned an automated voice. In a split second, Tatarstan Airlines Flight 363 slammed into the ground beside the runway. Pitched 75 degrees nose down and barreling through 245 knots. The catastrophic impact obliterated the plane, carving a massive crater in the grass and instantly killing all 50 people on board. Shattered fragments of the 737 tumbled through the darkness across a nearby taxiway, coming to rest amid the eerie glow of 100 scattered fires. Rescuers rushed to the crash site immediately, but it was clear from the start that no one on board could have survived. Firefighters battled the fierce blaze that still burned deep within the impact crater, and the next day investigators from the Interstate Aviation Committee, MAK, arrived. MAK is an international body that investigates aircraft accidents across much of the former Soviet Union, including Russia. Over the past 15 years, it has earned a reputation for objectivity and thoroughness, even boldly criticizing the system in places where such scrutiny is rare. The investigation team, however, was a mix of various interest groups, representatives from Rosaviatsia, the Russian state aviation regulator, Boeing, the manufacturer, officials from the United Kingdom since the plane was registered in Bermuda, and Tatarstan Airlines. The tensions among these parties would later prove central to the crash's enduring legacy. Evidence from the black boxes, studies and simulator tests revealed that the accident stemmed from the captain's spatial disorientation during the go-around. The pilots, off course due to inertial reference drift they failed to correct, decided to attempt a go-around under immense stress. Stress compounded by the large course deviation, Salikov's inexperience with go-arounds, pressure from the airline over landing in good weather with a politically connected passenger, and possible fatigue from the late hour. All these factors converged at the critical moment of the go-around. Captain Salikov likely assumed the autopilot would handle the go-around, so he paid little attention to the pitch. Meanwhile, First Officer Gutzel was distracted for nearly 20 seconds by a conversation with air traffic control, a distraction the MAK noted was unnecessary during a go-around. This lack of communication and monitoring caused the plane to climb too steeply. When Salikov sharply pitched down to stop the climb, the resulting G-forces disorientated him, tricking his body into thinking the plane was inverted. In his confusion, he pushed the yoke fully forward, sending the plane into a fatal dive. But the in-flight events were only a small part of what MAK uncovered. Their investigation into why a supposedly trained 737 pilot botched the go-around revealed a far larger problem. None of those involved in Captain Salikov's career were spared scrutiny. Salikov had spent over 17 years as a navigator on Soviet-built aircraft before beginning pilot training in 2008, allegedly accumulating 217 hours on the Antonov AN-2 and earning his first air transport license. However, MAK found no evidence beyond his personal logs that this training occurred. Later that year, Rosaviatsia even revoked the certificate from the training organization where he was said to have learned to fly, as it was found to be in violation of regulations. But what happens when the speed brakes don't deploy and the engines idle, bleeding speed every second, when no one notices until the ground is rushing up to meet them? That story is next. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more aviation stories.